All right, hi everyone. Today I'd like to introduce Dr. Paul Floch. He is a graduate of Harvard's PhD program in Mechanical Engineering and Material Sciences. He's also the co-founder and CEO of a neurotech startup called Axoft. Their mission is to improve safety and effectiveness of medical devices for the treatment of neurological disorders by using bio-inspired materials. So, Dr. LaFloch, can you tell us your story? I'd love to hear a bit more about your background.
Hi, Bob. Yes, of course. So first and foremost, I come from France, grew up in France, and I moved to the US about 7.5 years ago. I am an engineer and scientist by training. I was specialized in material sciences, and I came to the US to do my PhD. As you mentioned, that was on the East Coast at Harvard University. And it's interesting because um, I was not initially trained to do bioelectronics, but I learned that through my PhD. And I think the interest came from a genuine care for how we can improve healthcare. When I was younger, um, my father was a chemist, so I learned a lot from him about science, but he also died when I was 17 from a cancer that came back again and again. And in hindsight, I think it progressively drove me in the medical space when I had the opportunity. And that's really through my PhD at Harvard that I was able to apply the learnings from engineering to bioelectronics, and that connected to the medical space with the creation of Axoft 2.5 years ago. And Axoft, as you mentioned, is a neurotechnology company. We're developing implants. We have a very strong expertise in biomaterials and in electronics. And the reason we started Axoft is because we think we are only scratching the surface of what we can do with implants. And we have limited ways to communicate with the nervous system, and it can be improved tremendously. And we want to use science to do that.
Yeah, it sounds like you've had an interesting journey thus far, and we're definitely excited to talk a lot more about Axoft today. But before we dive into the details of your startup, and you already touched a little bit on this, but I was wondering if you could go into a bit more detail about what sparked your initial interest and involvement, like specifically in neuroscience or neurotechnology. Is that something that you discovered during your time in undergrad, or is it a passion that you first developed like during your PhD?
I think I was always intrigued by biology, but I only had introduction to it. And I was fascinated by the fact that the body can communicate between organs with electrical signals. And that related to something I knew much better, is the physics and the electrical engineering. And um, and then it's later during my PhD that we realized that there was a strong material science problematic in bioelectronics. And that's how I connected the dots and was able to jump into it. So initially for me, it was a way to learn about a topic that I really liked, and then to contribute to it with new technologies. And that turned to become Axoft. But I think there was I was really intrigued scientifically about these questions of how the body functions, how the brain functions, and this complex bioelectric machine, and how we can design tools to interact with it.
It's really awesome some of the um you know some of the parallels that you can see between like engineering machines and, as you mentioned, this complex bioelectronic machine that we have inside of our bodies. And so now I'll pass it off to Yu Ching, and she'll ask you some more detailed questions about Axoft and about the technology and the translation and all of those sorts of things.
Yeah. Um, One of the first things I want to start off with is you spoke a lot of like applying things in engineering and physics back towards like healthcare and things like that. I'm curious, how has, especially going from a very high pressure PhD kind of environment to an even possibly more high pressure startup environment, how has your work and responsibilities changed as you going from academia to industry?
Yeah, that's a great question. It has changed a lot because, you know, when you do science, you mostly doing experiments and work for yourself during your PhD. And now we are really trying to turn this into a viable business. And the stakes are real and there is no safety net. But I think I have a personality where I enjoy this situation. I enjoy challenges. And on top of that, I felt how can I say that? I felt almost obligated to do it because if I don't take my innovations and the research I've done before into a real application, into the real world, I don't think anybody else was going to take it over and do it successfully in the near term. So I had a special reason for me to start this company. And then, yeah, the responsibility have changed a lot. Early stage startup, you know, there is the fundraising aspect, there is the pitching and the communication aspect, building a team of experts. It's particularly important when you work on a deep tech or very complex technology, because if the team is not extremely motivated and robust and knowledgeable and not enjoying it, then it's not going to happen. So I'm lucky enough that I'm not the only one doing this. I have two co-founders. One is my PhD advisor, but the third one is full-time, and he's CTO of the company. And together we split the roles. So the pressure is not entirely on me. So that's different from the academic journey, in the sense that if you have multiple co-founders, you can share the burden. But yeah, does that answer your question?
Oh, yes, certainly. And I'm curious if you have a larger team now compared to before, where when you were a PhD, you might have like a team of PhD students as well as undergrads helping you work on this project.
This is a slightly larger team. I guess my function as the project at the university was still very interdisciplinary. Bioelectronics and medical devices and brain implants. It takes a village to get it done. There are a lot of things that can go wrong. So you work with electrical engineers, with bioengineers, with neuroscientists, and people working on data analysis. It's just that instead of being being part of this chain, now it's more like trying to design this chain and how in the company we can take this innovation and have a very fast iteration cycle so we can keep improving it. And that's been the main focus over the last 2 years for Axoft.
And very exciting as well, you recently put out the paper on combining the fluorinated elastomers that you guys developed as the group with some of the thin film electrodes to form like a 3D stackable device. And this has achieved a significantly higher electrode density without really affecting the flexibility of the electrode, which is highly desirable to reduce scarring and just improve chronic recording. I was curious, what is your team, now that is published and out, what is the team looking at next in terms of maybe developing towards human testing? What's the next step?
Yeah, I think that there are two main, this is a great summary, by the way. There are two main aspects we're working on right now. We're still scaling up the capabilities of the technology. We don't want to stop to what's described in that research paper, because the potential of the technology is to actually go beyond the standards in terms of number of sensors or longevity. And that is unlocked by our ability to design the material that is used to make the implant, instead of using materials that have been designed for the semiconductor industry and therefore never been designed to be inside the brain. So that's one aspect. We want to keep this fast R&D because there is so much more we can do. And second, we are developing new materials that have not been used with patients before. So we want to quickly demonstrate that we can pass with flying colors the standards of biocompatibility and quality that are imposed by the FDA for novel materials and for implants in general. So we're doing it right now, and so far it's been very successful. And once this is demonstrated, we hope that we'll be able to quickly use it in a patient demonstration and show the advantage of a technology.
That is very exciting. Have you, out of curiosity, have you found, did you have to really navigate the FDA pathways while you were still at Harvard, or is this a new thing that you have been, you've had to learn along the way?
Yes, we had to learn that. None of us has a background in FDA and a regulatory path for medical implants, but we've found great advisors to support us with it. And since day one, we started the conversation with FDA. We obtained FDA breakthrough device designation very quickly with the goal to communicate at a faster pace with them and understand how the path is going to look like for regulation of these devices. And a lot of the other BCI companies are also taking this direction of trying to have an active discussion. The FDA is very intrigued by brain-computer interface and trying to design guidelines that will ensure safety and effectiveness of the devices that are approved. And so we're part of this journey. We're still very early, but everything we do, we keep that in mind, that we want to make something that eventually will be able to be useful for the patients and improve their quality of life.
And so we've talked a little bit so far about the FDA and clinical translation. So I was wondering, even when some of the early work for this started way back during your PhD, has clinical translation always been at top of mind, or is that something that you guys kind of started thinking about later as you realized how useful and applicable these materials could be compared to what we're currently seeing out there on the market?
That's a good question. The truth is, we didn't think about that in the beginning, because initially we developed the technology to solve a problem that neuroscientists had. That is, how do we create a long-lasting, high-resolution interface with nervous tissues? It's very difficult to have these high-resolution signals, but making last for a long time. Usually rigid implants in academic labs, they last for a few days to a few weeks, and that's a real bummer. And we can already do much better with our technology, so we just focused on that, but it does not imply the clinical translation. So we had to start thinking about the other problematics when we started the company. And just to name a few, there is this biocompatibility testing I mentioned. There is sterilization, hermetic packaging, lots of things. So it's integrated into our thinking. But yeah, it's been a little bit challenging, and we're still navigating it, but we've done a lot of progress.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and thank you for kind of walking me through your mindset on that, from where you started and where it lies now.
And touching on something that you mentioned previously, you mentioned the word obligation in terms of first starting to look at it from a material science perspective, and then thinking through that how this could be of use in this field, and then leaping into this startup journey. I'm wondering if you have any, obviously material science is going to be a big part of making better neurointerfaces just from chronic standpoint. I wonder if you have any thoughts about whether the neurotech space would benefit from adding experts from a specific field or background, like for example in material science.
Yeah, I have an opinion on that. I think the neurotech space, and in particular the implant space, is a very unforgiving place. It's a complex piece of engineering with many facets. For a medical implant to work, it takes an excellent, multidisciplinary, motivated team that puts in true effort. And obviously I'm biased, but I think that the fields like biomaterial experts, material science, and bioengineering, because it is still one of the unsolved problems that prevents us from truly improve by orders of magnitude or ability to communicate with the nervous system. So right now, most companies are settling on device architectures that are entirely dictated by materials that have been designed for electronic components, but not to interact with the body. And that's why I think this is the right type of profile that should join neurotech now, because now we have these first few companies that are getting into clinical trials are being successful to demonstrate clinical benefits. And the next generation of BCI and implant company needs to focus on the next set of problems that remains that are a bit more related to material science, I think.
That's a really good point. And I think we've definitely seen a neurotech space move towards thin film technologies and taking some of the things that we developed in semiconductor industry for like fabrication techniques and stuff and applying this to neurotech. Speaking of those other companies that exist, do you ever communicate with those leaders and, for example, trade tips like, oh, like I think your device would benefit from having our coating on it, for example, or our polymer?
Yeah, I cannot disclose too much, but we start to have some of those conversations because indeed some technologies can apply to other companies. I mean, and the BCI field is a very friendly field. The companies are trying to help each other. It's not really a race of who gets there first, but more like how are we going to make this whole thing work together? We don't know yet who has the best solution. There are other fields where this is happening as well. Just to draw a comparison, it's the same in for quantum computers. There are a lot of technologies being developed, all different, and we don't know which one is going to be the most scalable. So I think it's the same, and yeah, Axoft has because of the nature of our innovation, we have a strong play there that we can enable other companies, and we want to keep this as an option for us. But yeah, it's we're going to see more and more partnership between companies, I think, in the future in the BCI space.
That would be very, very exciting. I think for sure we're seeing a very big boom in terms of the number of companies and the number of ideas out there for this field. And I can't wait to see what you guys collaborate and come up with next. Let's talk about like so far, not saying anything in the future about collaborations and stuff. Have you found talking to other companies helpful in the process of starting a startup? Like, you talked about consulting experts in terms of regulation and other business. Did you ever talk to other startups to like learn about, oh, like there may be some roadblocks to avoid?
Yeah, of course. There are a lot of companies that I met through different startup accelerators in the neurospace, and we have like WhatsApp groups and we talk about the news and share contacts, whether it's for consulting, whether it's for advisors, or even investors. But it's very important. It's just like for other fields for startups, there is a pretty strong community in the neurotech space right now.
That's really good to hear. I have a few more questions about the more specific products that Axoft has been pioneering. Going back to the paper and also past publications that you guys have had, what you have targeted so far is a lot of chronic and like spatiotemporal resolution and scalability, as you said. And I'm wondering, in your opinion, are there any constraints or is there a ceiling that you think to what is possible to reach in terms of this resolution ratio?
Yeah, I think there is a ceiling, but I think it's much higher than where we are right now, that we can still improve by multiple orders of magnitude our ability to interact with brain tissues in terms of data rate or in terms of longevity. And it's totally feasible. It's an engineering challenge. And so that's why I'm very hopeful for this space.
And I'm curious about for these like resolution and things like that, because the people who are going to be using this data is going to be neuroscientists and physicians. Could you tell me a little about how throughout the process of developing this material and then starting to apply it more and more towards clinical applications, how you've collaborated with different physicians and like neuroscientists to figure out what they want and how you can meet those needs?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and there's a lot to say there, and a lot of stakeholders will have a different opinion. Some clinicians are not interested in having a lot more data, but are interested in having a system that is less invasive or create less damage. And some others are more interested into the data, and that totally depends on the use case. So if you think about enabling neuroscience, yes, Data is important. We've done a lot of progress from measuring 1 neuron to 100 neurons and beyond that. So we'll keep making progress. That's obvious. On the clinical side, it's hard to tell because until these tools have been used by clinicians, you can't really have an opinion on if it's going to provide benefit to the patients. So we will see how the first BCI companies getting to clinical trials will demonstrate these benefits. But people are hopeful, and I think there are other user needs that we're trying to integrate, at least at Axoft, into our visions of the medical implants. It doesn't always relate to spatiotemporal resolution. It relates to invasiveness, damage, easiness of use, whether it's for chronic or for temporary implants. And so what I'm saying is there are a lot of other factors that can be integrated into the design of those new devices. And it's important because if we're not carefully doing this, then we will not design tools that are actually helpful for the patients. So that's why we've tried to have as many advisors in the clinical space early on so that we make sure that our technology is solving one of the current problems that the clinicians are facing. And we kind of find the right balance between the innovation that we think about and the external advice that we get and from clinicians and from users.
That makes a lot of sense. And I imagine it's also like constantly a trade-off that you have to think about in terms of all the things that people are requesting that they want. Following up on longevity, I'm curious, I know we're a little bit away from this now, but do you think it's possible to eventually reach an electro implant that is pretty much functional and will stay in the human body, in the brain for an entire human lifespan?
Yes, I think it's totally feasible. There is a lot of engineering to do to get there, but the moment you can already have implants that can provide a clinical benefit for a few years, and then we understand the reasons why it's failing at some point, and we can solve these problems, and yes, I think it's going to happen in our lifetime. But biology is not a system that's always reproducible, and surgery either. So there is a spectrum of outcomes when you have an implant, just like some patients can have a deep brain stimulators for a decade, and it's fine. And for some others, it requires to move the implants or to change lead. So there will always be a spectrum. But I think overall, we are going to see tremendous improvement in the longevity of those novel devices. And that's one of the things that we're targeting with Axoft is how we're going to make sure that this is going to last for a very long time when it's used by a patient, because obviously the surgery impacts a lot the decision of the patients and the clinicians and if it's worth it, essentially. So yeah, very good point.
Yeah, I totally agree. A lot of because we've also seen from various other medical implants that have come and gone in the past that you just really need in vivo testing at some point, especially in humans. Do you think Axoft will be moving towards other animal testing soon, or do you think the team is focusing more on developing ways to make the implant better before we get there?
So I guess we're doing both. We are working on novel generation of the implants. We have some partnerships with technology being used by other users in the preclinical space, because that allow us to have a very fast pace of iteration that we could not have if we're just working on our own. And while we want to get into the medical space, we also want to be mindful that we want to do it where we have all the cards in hand to do the best technology possible for the patients. And this is a little bit antagonistic to the classical regulatory path for medical devices, where you need to freeze your technology and your design for a long time before you can commercialize it. And I think it's fine for some companies to do that, but we have a very long-term vision at Axoft, and we don't want to have to freeze this technology at some point when we know that if we spend 6 months improving it is going to be 10 times better. So we will take our time and we'll come up with something that's really not been done before.
Sounds like a good strategy to me. I'm very excited to see what you guys put out next.
Yeah, and I'm definitely excited to see what's next as well. And the more I hear about Axoft, the more excited I get about it. And so we've been talking a lot about the future of your company and the future of neurotech and the future of these implants today. And so I wanted to zone in on that and discuss the future a little bit more. And so I was wondering if you have any predictions for the future of neurotechnology over the long term. Let's say perhaps maybe the next 20 years. And maybe you can touch both from a zoomed in perspective and the specific subset of the field that you're working in, as well as a zoomed out perspective and just the applications at large and impacts on society.
Yeah. Over the next 20 years, what I'm pretty sure we're going to see brain-computer interface as a new type of medical device that's poised to happen. There are multiple companies in clinical trials, so it's in the next 5 to 10 years, actually, not even 20 years. But within 20 years, hopefully we'll get a significant adoption of the technology, not just a few users, but really have this widespread, just like it happened for all the types of devices in the second half of the 20th century. For cochlear implants, for deep brain stimulators. So hopefully that will happen too for brain-computer interface. And then I think there will also be a lot of progress in the indications that can be treated. There's been a lot of work recently on how deep brain stimulator can be used to stimulate circuits relating to disease that were not initially the target for these implants. So I think we might be able to have approval for this type of neuromodulation for new indication that could range from addiction, depression, and other complex neuropsychiatric disorders. So this is also poised to happen. And then there is the convergence of those two things with the novel technologies and the novel indications. And it's, I think, yeah, so both from the indication and device perspective, there will be tremendous progress. And then the field is also trying to move toward minimally invasive technologies, which is great. Some technologies are already considered as minimally invasive. Even deep brain stimulators by neurosurgeons are considered as minimally invasive because it can be done very precisely with very repeatable surgery and minimized craniotomy or burr hole. So hopefully this will become very standard to the point where we consider having a neural implant as common as a pacemaker. So I think that's a beautiful vision for the next 20 years.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the field will see a massive expansion over these next 20 years. And I think there's really exciting times ahead, like both in terms of the development of the technology as well as the indications that it might be used for. And I think these things like BCIs and other forms of neurotechnology, deep brain stimulation, for example, I think they'll end up helping more and more people as we move into the future. And so another follow-up I had, as we stay on that theme of talking about the future, there's a lot of young engineers that are interested in getting involved with this field. And so I was wondering if you had any advice for those young engineers that are hoping to work in this field someday. For example, how can they get involved? What sorts of things should they be training with or studying, and just any advice in general you have for these young engineers, or maybe even people approaching this field from different directions, for example, medical professionals?
Yeah, my main piece of advice would be for engineers that are not already connected to the clinical space to really try to learn more about that, to hear about the opinion of the neurologists, the neurosurgeons, the users, the patients, because at the end of the day, this is the driving factor. And it's easy for engineers to kind of like just work on the technology without thinking about like who is going to be the user. So I think that's the best, because then you can come up with a real world problem to solve. And so the best is to go to conferences, can be one way, go to the university, connect with the professors working on these topics, and try to find what's a worthwhile problem to solve for healthcare.
Yeah, I totally agree with that advice, like making sure to stay patient-centered, and especially for these technologies that have a future in clinical translation, it's really important to keep that end user in mind. And so I think that was all the questions we had for you today. I wanted to thank you again for coming on. It's been much appreciated. It's been a super interesting conversation. And before we logged off, I wanted to ask, should our listeners contact you for further discussion after the episode? And if so, who should reach out to you? How can they reach out to you? And what sorts of topics should people reach out to you about?
If people can reach out to us about any topic, we're very open-minded, and still a small and nimble company that really try to reply to everything we receive. We have, I will send it to you afterwards, but we have a general email address where people can just like send us a message about what they want to discuss. And if it's for partnership, we also have a page depending on where the interest lies, if it's for clinical, for preclinical, or for more like the material science aspect that we're developing. So these two avenues are available for future discussions.
Yeah, sounds good. I just want to wish both of you a great rest of your day, and I say that I really enjoyed our conversation today.
Likewise, thank you both.